Our scripture comes from the book of Daniel and will for the next 4 weeks because we're going to do a book study in the book of Daniel. I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go, but let's read the scripture. Feel free to follow along as it's printed in the bulletin. Janet, I was about ready to have you read this one because it's too many hard words for me. Let us hear the word. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. These he brought to the land of Shinar and placed the vessels in the treasury of his gods. Then the king commanded his palace master, Ashpenaz, to bring some of the Israelites to the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. They were to be taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years so that at the end of that time, they could be stationed in the king's court. Among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. May God add blessing to the hearing and understanding of these words this day. How'd I do? Did I do okay? Now you notice it's Abednego, not Abendigo. That's what a lot of people, they like to switch up that N and the D. This is a very interesting book. It's a part of what they call apocalyptic literature in the Bible. Do you know what apocalypse is? Apocalyptic literature. It's literature about the end times. What's going to happen when all is said and done. When God decides that this world is done for. And so, now, in this particular piece of apocalyptic literature, there's no Jesus, right? It's Old Testament. So there's no Jesus in this. And we do not even really get the apocalyptic part of the book of Daniel until the last 6 chapters. Chapters 7 through 12 are more of the apocalyptic nature of this book. And it's kind of an interesting book. It's actually a weird book. Because chapters 1 through 6, and that's where we're going to primarily focus our study. Those first 6 chapters are stories that you're going to know well. The last couple of weeks of our study, you will recognize these stories because it's going to be Daniel in the lion's den. It's going to be the 3 friends in the fiery furnace and how they remain faithful even in the most difficult of circumstances. These first 2 stories in our series will not be as known, but they're as wonderful because these 3 friends and Daniel as their leader, in a sense, that's the way it kind of is portrayed in the book. They will stay faithful, even in the midst of exile. Our question will be, well, what is our exile? If we're to truly relate to these young men, we will have to think into our own lives to some degree. When have I been in the fiery furnace? When have I been with the lions? When have I been exiled, taken from my comfortable surroundings to a new and unknown place? We're going to have to get into the depths. Some of us, that's an easy answer. Some of us have been fortunate, maybe even blessed, to not have many difficulties in life. And so maybe we'll have to dig a little deeper. But until we remember our own personal exiles, we'll be far away from these young men. The other part is that we'll get the chance to remember that we've been freed from that exile, that we've been delivered from those difficult moments in our lives. The book of Daniel is written in 2 languages. Another reason why it's kind of a weird book. Not only is it weird because we have 6 chapters of really good stories about being faithful in exile, and then we get 6 chapters of what the apocalypse is going to look like in a vision that comes to Daniel. That's weird in and of itself because it's not a consistent book. It's 2 very distinct books, in a sense, all in one. But it's written in 2 languages, Aramaic and Hebrew. And so it would be great if you just thought, oh, well, 6 chapters of Aramaic and 6 chapters of Hebrew, but it doesn't work that way. It doesn't line up in any shape, form, or fashion. There's nothing easy about it. And so we begin our study. Now, these young men grew up in Israel. Israel, you know, is the promised land of God to the promised people of God. And as long as they kept covenant, they were able to stay in this land. They were able to stay in this place where God's presence was with them always because they had the temple. We are going to study tonight about the tabernacle in our adult study. And in fact, in our children's study, we will study about the tabernacle where God lived in the midst of the Hebrew people. We'll wait for that lesson. But God was with them. Lived in a certain part of their worship center. And as long as they saw the smoke, they knew that God was present with them. And as long as they kept the covenant, they knew that all that they could see, all that land, all around them was theirs. Well, Babylon, under the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, kind of one of the first world powers, at least in that part of the world, conquers Israel. It says in our reading today that God allowed it to happen. I'd love to have that conversation, but another day. Nebuchadnezzar sends an army. They conquer Israel. And what happens in those days is that the best and the brightest, the most affluent, the most educated, the religious leaders, the political leaders were uprooted, and they were taken to a new land where they were allowed to live. Did they have the same freedoms and the same experiences as being in their homeland? Probably not. These guys are going to be lucky. The people who were left were leaderless. The grunts, the followers, the farmers, the gophers. And that's exactly what they became for the new government that was put in place in their homeland. They're living in their land with strangers as their leaders. And so, until they are able to rise up and find new and good leaders who will be able to organize an army to push out, this is how they will live. As servants, not necessarily slaves, but kind of, to this new regime. So our 4 guys, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, as we will surely know them. We don't know them as Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael. But Daniel, who is Belteshazzar, we continue to know him as Daniel. I think that's also an interesting part of this book. Daniel gets to keep his Hebrew name throughout the whole of the book, but these 3 guys are better known as Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego for the rest of the book. I don't know why. They are taken. And then they are chosen. Did you hear the description? Incredibly good looking, incredibly intelligent, able to serve in the king's palace. They had to be gifted. They had to be gifted. They wowed people. They'd be your CEOs and your political leaders today. And they were to be retrained. They had to learn a new language. They had to learn a new way of living. They had to learn a new religion. But that's where things stopped for them. They were not going to do that. So here they would be in the king's palace, learning all these traditions, being trained just like other princes who were born in this land. All of them being learned in the ways of being able to serve in the king's palace. This is going to cause issues. As we get deeper into our study, we're going to understand that's why they get thrown into the furnace. That's why they get thrown into the lion's den. It's because they will hang on to their traditions from home, even in this new land. Even as they're being trained to be leaders in this new land, they will not give up their faith. They will be faithful in exile. I wonder if we would be the same. What we haven't read in this first chapter is this. Did you hear that when they were being trained, that they were going to get some stuff? They were going to be trained for 3 years, and at the end, they would find out where their duties were going to be. Well, they were going to get special food and wine. They were going to get food straight from the king's table to theirs. And it would have been more than their counterparts would have ever gotten who were brought into this land. They're lucky. They're privileged. They're blessed. They're fortunate. Whatever word you want. They're not slugging it out down in the farms and helping the rest of Babylon out. They're in the palace. And if they're going to serve the king, well, they have to look a certain way. They have to keep their strength up. They have to keep their physique up. They've got to sharpen their minds. So they're going to get the best food and the best training. But when it comes to the food, you might remember from other studies you've done with the Bible that the Hebrew people, the Jews, even to this day, have special food laws. They have dietary restrictions passed on from the time that they started with Passover and moving into the present day. This is a long time, a long history of observing food rituals. And so, when they are told that they will be given special food, they resist. They resist. Daniel talks to the palace master and says, could we just do our own thing when it comes to food? Do we have to eat this stuff? And the palace master's like, well, I have to tell you, if you grow weak, I'm in trouble. It's my head if you don't live up. So, yeah, you got to do it. But Daniel doesn't stop. He goes to the guard who's responsible for taking care of them and says, you know what, me and my 3 friends, we'd really like to not have to eat that food. And the palace guard is like, and Daniel says, test us in 10 days. Test us in 10 days. And if we have grown weaker, then we will obey and we will eat what we're supposed to eat. But if not, then continue to let us follow our ways. Let us continue to eat the way that we know how to eat. And so the guard lets that happen. And at 10 days, they get tested. And do you know what? They're stronger than the others. They're in better shape. As the course of time goes, it turns out that these 4 men not born are smarter, are stronger, and are better in the ways of the spirits because of their faith, even in exile. They are, it says at the end of chapter 1, that they are 10 times better than any of the other magicians or sorcerers in the king's palace. 10 times better, which in the Bible just means they were infinitely better than anybody else. Just interesting stuff. But it's at this point that if we're going to interact in this text that we have to begin to ask ourselves, would I resist the extravagances of food and wine? Or would I try to live up to my religious obligations? It's possible that food was really good. I mean, it's coming from the king's table. It had to be good. Key lime pie and cheesecake for everyone. A never-ending glass of wine. But Daniel says, this we will not do. Could you? Could I? I'm not sure. I can't even imagine. I mean, I've moved a little bit in my life, but I've chosen most of that. When I was a kid, I didn't choose it so much, but I went with my family, so it was fine. But in my adult years, I've chosen when I was moving from one place to another. I've never been forced to have to leave my homeland. And there are people who do have to choose. There are people who, for political reasons or religious reasons, will not be able to live in their homes. I've resettled some with the work of church and God and other organizations. We've helped people move from Africa to Louisville, Kentucky. It's hard. I don't know if I've shared this story or not. It's an aside. It's not one I planned to share, but I'm going to share it with you anyway. This family that came from Africa to Louisville, they went with another family from church to the zoo. And in the zoo in Louisville, there's this special African section. And there was a hut. And the young woman who was maybe 19 or 20 already with 4 children ran to that hut and laid down on the ground and said, "Oh, this is home." Can you imagine? Not only that, as they were walking through, the husband was walking with the husband of the church from the family from our church, and every time they passed an animal, he was like, "Oh, shot that, eaten that, done that." Our zoo animals, their food. Not all of us are fortunate or blessed enough to be able to just be where we want to be. Some are forced out. Some are forced into exile. But all of us have our own exiles. You have your own exile, and you know it. Get in touch with that. For the next few weeks in church, be in touch with that. Because we can't celebrate the good news of being delivered from that exile unless we get there. There's a story about Desmond Tutu from Africa, South Africa. Maybe you remember apartheid and what happened with that. So much has changed in the last 20 plus years for that country. But there was a time when blacks and whites couldn't even walk on the same sidewalk. It was the custom that if black people and white people in South Africa were walking on the same sidewalk and they were meeting each other, the black people would have to step off and bow their heads in respect. So one day, Desmond Tutu is walking with his mom and they're on the sidewalk and there's a man dressed in religious garb. And as they're approaching, Desmond Tutu and his mom are about to step off the sidewalk and bow their heads when this Anglican priest steps off the sidewalk and bows his head in respect to them. A young Desmond Tutu doesn't know what to do with that, and he says to his mom, "What just happened?" And she says, "Well, my son, this man is an Anglican priest, and in his studies and in his reading of the Bible and in his interaction with this gospel, he has understood compassion and kindness, and he has lived it out for us this day." And Desmond Tutu said it was at that exact moment in his life that he decided that he would become an Anglican priest. Can you imagine? From exile to the priesthood. From a system of slavery and inequality to being the bishop of the church of a free South Africa. Faithful in difficult moments. Faithful in exile. But let us not forget the example and the compassion and the kindness that that priest first showed him. For he lived in the same exile, just on the opposite side. Fred Craddock was in North Carolina, and he was showing up for a time when he was going to preach at a church, and he was to do a Friday night, a Saturday night, and a Sunday morning. It was a 3-day kind of revival, a study, and as he got there, he noticed that the church parking lot was full, which he thought was unusual since he wasn't supposed to preach for another 4 or 5 hours. There was a funeral happening at the church, and he tried to park out of the way and tried to be out of the way, but the minister saw him and greeted him and waved him over, and uncomfortably, Fred made his way. The minister was standing there talking to the woman, a widow, with 4 children. Introductions were made. Again, Fred was feeling quite uncomfortable, and he was trying to say whatever he could say, and he was like, "I'm really sorry for your loss, and I know that this is a difficult moment." And she said, this newly widowed woman said, "Yes, it is a difficult moment, and therefore I will not be at church tonight." And Fred said, "That is completely understandable. I get it." And she said, "But I will be here tomorrow, and I will be here on Sunday." And Fred is like, "Oh, you don't have to." And she's like, "I will be here because this is my church, and they will make sure that my children and I are okay." Always 2 sides to exile. Always the opportunity to be faithful. May it be so for all of us this day, no matter where we are in our journey in life. Amen.